Early on with development of Mafia 3, we knew we needed a city that could be treated as a main character. We wanted a city that was iconic, a city that had a lot of history to it, but also felt very different from Empire Bay, which is kind of an amalgamation of a couple different cities, but most often is associated with like Chicago and New York. And then also something that we could look at and say, well, the time period really resonates with it, right? By that point, we kind of knew that we were going to be at least somewhere in the 60s. We didn't know exactly where yet or how many years would pass, but we knew we wanted to be in the 60s. You know, we kind of cast around with a lot of different ideas, and when the idea of New Orleans came up, it really was the perfect city because it checked off all those boxes.
New Orleans is a very iconic American city. Like, you know, you see the wrought iron, you know, work on the buildings. You see a picture of the French Quarter, you immediately know that it's New Orleans.
For me, it's always had this kind of, and this has changed for me over the course of the project. When I started the project, it was very, very like mysterious to me. It was sort of dangerous and sexy, and it had this sort of like this heat that pervaded, not just, you know, physical heat, but this kind of this sense that everything was kind of exciting and dangerous.
Video games often depict American cities in digital form. Los Angeles, DC, Boston, Chicago, and New York have all played host to open-world games. But with Mafia 3, Hangar 13 is venturing down to New Orleans, a city foreign to many Americans. It's a lively place. It's a balmy place. New Orleans is a city that ebbs and flows, and in Mafia 3, it takes on new meaning in the form of New Bordeaux, Hangar 13's fictionalized metropolis, and the first truly open world in the Mafia series.
The city is always its own character. It's always like, you know, has its own vibe. For me, it was always about how do I boil down the experience both as a tourist level understanding and as somebody who has lived there. I'm very fortunate, and we have an art director across the way who is actually grew up in New Orleans. So that was a great place, a great way for me to go and test my ideas and say, hey, I'm looking for something that's a little bit, you know, off the beaten path, or not something that tourists understand. You know, what can you help me out with?
All units, code 60, officer injured on scene.
But it was always important to come back to that idea, like, for most people playing the game, they're not that familiar with it beyond a certain superficial understanding. So I wanted to make sure that that was always there as a reminder for them. And then as they progress through the hours and hours of narrative, they get to discover the city in the same way that, you know, a lot of the team did, going down and shooting reference footage and going out and doing that research.
You know, having never made a film, it's hard to compare. I don't know how much research goes into making a film, but I can only imagine that, you know, the level of research and the amount of research we did for this game, it feels like it was 3 films worth of research.
Pulling from all these very kind of disparate sources and just kind of, you know, a lot of it is just kind of tone inspiration.
His remains were found in the trunk of an old car. Both legs were broken so many times there was barely any bone left.
So we watched, you know, dozens and dozens of documentaries. We read hundreds of books, not just on the mob, but on, you know, everything from voodoo to, you know, the South to Vietnam and you know, kind of what the mentality of a Vietnam vet coming back might be like. Political corruption. I mean, it was all across the board. Tarantino is a big influence for us, you know, in the way that he handles music in particular. He takes certain tracks and kind of reinvents them by putting them into certain scenes, and there's always that weird discordant, you know, everyone, you know, almost every Tarantino movie has that one track that is very discordant, you know, where you're like, this doesn't really fit, like the music doesn't really fit the scene, but somehow it really works, and so we look for things like that to continue in the gameplay.
It's good to see you, I must go, I know I've a good run.
I think building up a soundscape for a city is a really important thing to do. It's one of the ways we achieve that is we build all these different layers of ambience, and so we'll have these background, midground, foreground ambience levels, and they're all kind of moving and blending from district to district. You know, you have some neighborhoods that are kind of more wealthy, you know, nice manicured lawns, and you might hear people mowing their lawn and gardening. Then you've got more industrial areas where you'll hear like shipyard sounds and cranes and machinery. And then you've got the bayou, which has a lot of kind of wildlife and cicadas and that kind of stuff.
But then we also knew that we had to adopt it to our own needs, right? So we decided that it wasn't going to be New Orleans, and in keeping with the franchise, where it's always fictional cities, we really wanted to kind of make it our own. So it's our version of New Orleans.
I'm in Frisco Fields and need some new wheels.
Just gonna take a squirt, and I'll get her out to you.
Again, one thing that we talk about a lot are just the city streets, widening the city streets and giving the city some elevation so that it's more fun to drive. We built a whole underground network of tunnels, which again is nowhere near the reality of New Orleans, but we wanted to make it so that you could drive boats around there and play up this idea of kind of bootlegging during the Prohibition era, and the idea of pirates and all these other things that are kind of cool elements in New Orleans. We brought the swamp in really close to the city so that we have the bayou and you can go out and feed people to alligators in the swamps, right? So, so we did a lot of things like that, and then we created its own history as well.
We always needed to remind the player of the city that they were in, and that kind of really started to inform even how we laid out the city. Most people's concept of New Orleans when they go there is like, well, it's the French Quarter, the bayou, those things resonate for people. So it's no mistake that our version of the French Quarter is slap bang in the middle of the city, and it forces the player to constantly crisscross it as they move around. It's just that visual reminder of the place that you're in.
Yeah, well, the car radio system was something we put a lot of time into. We decided early on we wanted to make it act like a real radio system. So, for example, if you're listening to one station, you get out of the car and go across the street and you walk into a bar that's playing the same station, you're going to hear that same song with the amount of time that's traveled since you left your car. We wanted to build out full radio stations with station IDs and commercials and news broadcasts that change and evolve based on what the player does.
We consider the story historical pulp fiction, and one of the ways we really approach that is the interweaving of real-world historical events with fictional events in the game. So as you drive around in the car, we have a lot of real-world news stories you'll hear on the radio. It's everything from, hey, this major battle occurred in Vietnam. There's, the fair housing portion of the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1968. There's discussions of that, pulp culture, and everything kind of in between. And I think what that really does is help ground our narrative in the real world, so that when we layer our fiction on top of that, it makes it feel real.
Take another step and he gets it. You think I give a shit about some politician?
Please, I don't even know what's going on.
Mafia 3 takes place in New Bordeaux because we really haven't had the opportunity to see what crime looks like in the South. I think not very many games have been able to or willing to explore that space. Bill talked about this a little bit earlier, but New Orleans and the South in general were sort of where the Mafia had a wonderful foothold following the Civil War. And so being able to kind of reflect a little bit of that history in our present, in 1968, was just a tremendous opportunity to be able to show, here is this deeply rooted history, and here's how it's kind of manifest, almost 100 years later.
But Lincoln stops them, keeps them off her until the MPs show up. If he wasn't gonna kill that slag, he sure as wasn't gonna kill Olivia Marcano.
I wanted to feel dangerous, I wanted to feel sexy, I wanted to feel attractive. It's like that, you kind of want to touch the fire, but it's going to burn you when you touch it, that kind of thing. It's all about these kind of contrasts. It's about what do you see on the surface versus what's going on behind the scenes.
Take a look around. There's a goddamn war going on.
This is one thing I think people don't know, and I didn't even know until we started research on this project, but the New Orleans has a long, rich history with the Italian mob. It was actually one of the first cities that had, kind of an Italian mafia, and going all the way back to kind of the Black Hand, and then that evolving into the more traditional mafia. And at one point, this guy, Carlos Marcello, was a kind of traditional Italian mobster, but he was so removed from and so powerful that he didn't really have to answer to the commission, he or the five families, he kept them updated and whatnot, but he kind of operated with a large degree of autonomy that a lot of the other kind of heads of the various families didn't get.
Carlos Marcello, who is the godfather, real-world godfather of New Orleans, and one of our big inspirations for Sal Marcano, who's the head of the Italian Mafia in New Bordeaux. You can go on YouTube and watch his testimony before Congress. And I can't remember the exact number, but basically every question he pleads the fifth.
Isn't it a fact that it's a phony job? You don't sell tomatoes at all? This is just a way of legitimizing illegal income?
No, sir, it's not a phony job.
All right, then tell me who you sell the tomatoes to.
I sell to a lot of people in New Orleans.
You haven't been able to mention one. Can you mention one person you sell tomatoes to?
So even as you go through the open world, what you're doing is specifically targeting aspects of Sal Marcano's criminal organization. For example, there's some guy selling drugs. There's some, maybe there's a guy selling, stolen construction equipment. And you take them out, and what you're doing is you're damaging Marcano on a street level, because all the money flows up in the mob. So by taking out the money there, it impacts everyone above them. And what it does is exposes everyone as you move your way up the ladder.
Sure kept your head.
Again, one of the very first things we did when working on Mafia 3 was look back at Mafia 2 and say, okay, well, what are the things that were done really well in Mafia 2 and where are the areas where we know we need to improve based on, feedback and reviews and our own just impressions of playing the game. And I think, one of the things that game did really, really well was create this amazing sense of time and place. Like that city, Empire Bay, is incredible and it's incredibly detailed and it feels like a main character as you play the game. One of the things we knew we could improve upon was the open world nature of the game and make sure that there was a plenty of kind of gameplay in the open world. But we didn't want to go so far as to kind of create this free-for-all where it was just a bunch of random, unconnected, open world activities.
I think the secret to kind of figuring out how to make a living open world like this is starting very, very high level. Knowing what the story is that you want to tell about your city. And for us, New Bordeaux, the story was the South in 1968 and being able to inform every decision in every part of the city around that. What feels dangerous, what feels sexy, what feels pulpy, as you've described it, while also feeling true to the Mafia franchise. And then just kind of drilling down deeper and deeper in that. What kind of moments can we communicate? What kind of moments can we convey? What kind of dialogue can we have for two characters just walking around the street? What kind of reactions can they have to Lincoln Clay, our protagonist, as he's walking down the street?
I think he's gonna shoot someone. He's got a gun!
Just constantly articulating and building on that until we've got this, I make it sound simple, but this sort of vast world of characters who, as a player you can explore and seek out or just kind of stumble upon as you're going from one mission to the next.
Sounds like Handsome Harry's a little agitated.
Or the directive was, let's make sure that there's plenty to do in the open world, but that everything the player is doing in the open world either drives forward Lincoln's quest to tear down the Italian mob or his kind of, quest to build up his own family.
Give me some of your men. We're locking down the French war.
There's an urgency to Lincoln's quest and his mission, and we want to make sure that, it didn't feel weird and discordant that there were all these other activities that you could do in the game where you're like, why would Lincoln be doing that when, he's trying to do these other things and he knows he's got kind of a timeline to do it in before, the world hits him back.
Available unit. Reports of an armed Negro male in the French ward. Please investigate.
In Hangar 13's eyes, New Bordeaux is a character in itself. It drives the action, sets the tone, introduces us to mystery, conflict, and paranoia.
Lord almighty.
But what's a city without citizens? What's a town without politics? What's New Bordeaux without its crime, its tension, and its people, the ones who walk its streets and navigate the world they live in? That's what we're focusing on in the next and final episode of this series, the year 1968 and the way it shapes Mafia 3's cast, the problems they face, the ghosts that haunt them, and the way they're shaped by one of America's darkest hours.
How can these moments flesh out 1968? How can they make New Bordeaux feel like a living city that's populated by people who have thoughts, feelings, opinions, needs, wants, desires, that are all human? It's not just random chatter going on. It's actually, here's somebody who needs to pay their rent and they're struggling with that. Here's somebody who's strung out on drugs and here's how they're going to figure out how they're going to get their fix. Here's somebody's opinion on Sal Marcano being the crime boss at the top of the pyramid in their city and that sense of pervasive corruption going on there. And hey, there's some black guy going around killing a bunch of mobsters. What does that mean for me and my family? Making the world feel like it's lived in for 1968, but also making it feel like it's reacted to Lincoln Clay as a character, I think was very, very important. So we've just had to kind of figure out what some of those interesting moments are, and then where we can fill them out throughout the world.
What now? Have it your way.